Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. This week, we're talking about the death of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, a personal tragedy for his family and those who knew him, but also to many a watershed moment for Russia itself. He was the most prominent critic of President Vladimir Putin. He was a key mobilizing figure within Russia's much reduced, almost obliterated opposition. His charisma and personal courage in exposing corruption and embezzlement by the Kremlin were much admired in the West, and seemingly within Russia too, where hundreds of people have risked arrest to lay flowers for him. He was also a controversial and nationalistic figure whose position on Ukraine shifted but had at times enraged Ukrainians, especially with his comments over Crimea. The true circumstances behind his death at the Polar Wolf penal colony deep in Siberia may never be known, but world leaders have said that they hold Vladimir Putin directly responsible. We're going to talk about Navalny, the man. We'll talk about what he did, what he said, and what his death says about Russia now a quarter of a century under Putin. We'll also try and answer the question of what Russians think about the state of their country, a very hard question to get at with the oppression that is going on there. What they think about the war in Ukraine and Putin's now almost total retreat from the Euro-Atlantic world order. And we're going to touch right at the end on the big question, it's not going to be the last time, but of frozen Russian assets and whether they should be used to fund Ukraine's war effort and reconstruction at a time when Kyiv desperately needs the money. Joining me down the line to help me discuss all this is Bill Browder. He was the largest foreign investor in Russia until 2005, but became an enemy of Vladimir Putin after exposing corruption in Russian state-owned companies and after the death in custody of his lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky. He's, for many years now, worked as a human rights and anti-corruption campaigner. Welcome, Bill.
Great to see you.
Very good to have you here. Joining me as well is Nikolai Petrov, a consulting fellow with our Russia and Eurasia program. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Very, very good to have you here. And finally, with me in the studio is Yulia Mineeva, an Academy Fellow also with our Russia and Eurasia program, who before her time with us was head of news for Novaya Gazeta, the main independent newspaper in Russia, now published in Riga since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you here. Well, let's start, as I said, with talking about Navalny himself. Yulia, perhaps I can start with you. You were his neighbor for a time. What was your experience of him?
So I started working in journalism in 2014. At that point, Navalny was already undoubtedly the biggest opposition figure in Russia. It was after the cases of Kirov and during the case of Russia that later the government would use to put Navalny in prison, that he's never going to leave. Before that, there was a mayoral campaign in 2013, and for me, that was a first big election. I was a 19-year-old student, and I had a chance to vote for the first time, and I was volunteering in Navalny's campaign, and I was giving away his agitation newspaper in the Moscow underground. It's just impossible to imagine something like that going on in Moscow these days. So at that point, he would gather some meetings around the underground station in Moscow to talk to the local dwellers. And I was always surprised how bypasses that would usually by default be against Navalny would just come around, take the microphone, ask him a tricky question, but after that would always shake his hand and take a picture with him. So I would say that Navalny definitely had a gift of a gap, and his superpower was to successfully communicate with different stratas of Russian society. Talking about that campaign, one of my sources was telling me that FSB, which is these days KGB, trying to find some dirt and some dark spots about Navalny, and they were following him, and apparently they just couldn't find anything. And some of the bosses in FSB were saying, this is probably the guy that we actually need. He doesn't even have a mistress or something. So probably we should vote for him now. So yeah, I feel like it's a great example how Navalny could communicate with different people.
Let me go to Bill. Thank you very much for that. Bill, Navalny was your friend and you campaigned together. What do you think his death means for Russia?
I think it's a tragedy. It's an absolute tragedy for first for his family, second for his friends, and thirdly for every person in Russia. So Alexei Navalny, I don't think he set out to be a politician. He just sort of naturally gravitated into it. He discovered the thing that everybody cared about, which was that these crooks that ran the country were stealing all the resources of the country for yachts and planes and villas. And as he started to expose that through his social media, everybody started to gravitate around him. And of course, he's a very handsome, tall, charismatic person. And with this platform of getting rid of the crooks and thieves, as he said, it was just like this perfect natural political platform. And I mean, if you think about it, I mean, it's just so stark. You have this old man, Vladimir Putin, who's a crook, a murderer, who's sitting at the top of this country, but not really at the top of the country because the people want him there. Just he's sitting there and desperately trying to stay in control so he can keep his money and save his own life. And then you've got this other guy, Alexei Navalny, who's young, attractive, and he has like a positive message for everybody and doesn't have any skeletons in his closet. And it's just such a stark contrast. And you can see why Putin wanted to kill him because, he makes Putin look terrible. And, everyone says, oh, Putin has these high approval ratings. That's complete nonsense. Putin doesn't have any approval ratings. The moment that people could have if there was proper choice, if there's real competition, Putin would lose in a landslide.
Nikolai, what do you make of this? How much was he an effective opponent for Putin?
Well, I think Navalny was a unique politician who managed to become a most well-known politician in the absence of public politics. He did start as a blogger, became famous for his anti-corruption investigations, and on the eve of previous 2018 presidential elections, he managed to establish the single real opposition political party, which was supported by young generation and which had branches in almost all of Russian regions. That's why he became the real threat for the regime, and he did manage to broaden his electorate, and he managed to become the second most recognizable politician after Putin without using all these state media and so on.
And I mentioned at the top that he said some things in the past about Crimea that didn't make Ukrainians happy, about not giving Crimea back and so on. How should we regard some of the nationalistic things he said?
Well, first of all, Navalny, as any human being, could make mistakes. And he did make one in 2008 with regard to the war in Georgia. And since that time, he did apologize several times. When it goes about Crimea, I think it was different. And we should look at what he said about Crimea within the context. And there are two very important points. One is connected with the fact that Navalny was a politician, not an expert. He was a politician of a populist type, seeking for the electoral base, and he couldn't ignore the fact that overwhelming majority of Russians consider Crimea to be a historic part of Russia. It would be strange to wait for a politician who is trying to come to power, who is fighting to broaden his electoral base, to say something which is absolutely not supported by majority of his fellow countrymen. But the second point, I think, is even more important, and Navalny himself did explain this. It's the need to ask Crimeans not to decide whether Crimea should be returned to Ukraine or should be kept within Russia, in Moscow or in Kyiv. And this makes Navalny a kind of democratic civil nationalist. And I don't think there are any reasonable alternatives when in future the fate of Crimea will be decided.
You make a really important point there about where public opinion is in Russia, something we're going to come on to, but also that other countries, I'm thinking of Western Europe, should project everything onto Navalny that they might want from a Russian leader. They need to deal with the reality of indeed what Russians want. Yulia, we've watched a lot of Russians now risk arrest, risk their safety by placing flowers at the monument to victims of political repression. We've seen some of those arrested, indeed. What does this tell us about the enduring support for some kind of opposition?
So we should remember that in Russia 2024, there is absolutely no safe ways of protesting left because there is no rule of law in the country. And there were around 400 people arrested in 39 cities for laying flowers in the memory of Navalny. I should mention that Navalny's organization and structures around him are labeled extremist and undesirable organizations in Russia, and such sentiment as laying flowers might be considered as a participation in activity of or extremist or undesirable organization, and in turn, it can turn into a criminal case. Again, what it tells us is that the regime now completely moved from autocracy to totalitarianism and military dictatorship, that the laying flowers to the memorial of victims of political repressions became a criminal activity. So it's another signal that there will be no return to the state before the 24th of February 2022. And this new reality is irreversible, and everyone should feel apprehensive from now on, and everyone just should forget about Navalny. But at the same time, we don't see hundreds of thousands of people on the streets of Moscow. But I feel like it shouldn't fool us, because there are many Russians who care about the fact that Navalny is dead and treat it as a personal tragedy, as for many he was a face of hope for free democratic Russia that was now brutally taken away from them.
Bill, I wonder if you can pick up this point about whether there is any opposition left. There's a long list of Russian opposition figures killed during the Putin regime. Boris Nemtsov, I'm thinking, are there any potential successors now?
Well, I mean, Putin's whole objective is to make sure that there are none. And of course, Alexei was the obvious, real future president of Russia. And by killing him, he's gotten rid of any potential successors. And it's correct that there is no opposition in Russia right now, because you can't be opposition in Russia without going to jail or dying. And that's kind of the message. The message is, if we can kill Alexei Navalny, the consequence of being political opposition to Putin is death. But having said that, I mean, I think that there are a number of people. There's Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is sitting in jail. He was Boris Nemtsov's protege. He's serving his 25-year sentence in Siberia. There's Ilya Yashin, another opposition politician who's spending 8 years in jail. And if there was any oxygen for real competition in politics, Putin would definitely not be the president. I mean, even if he was a good guy, which he's not, he's a monster. But even if he's a good guy, you just can't sit around for 24 years and expect that people still want you. They get tired of you. And certainly they would be tired of him based on everything that he's done over the last 24 years. But I think that the only possibility of political change in Russia is public uprising. I don't think that there's any other way it's going to happen. I don't think that there's ever going to be another election until public uprising. And what I would say, and it's very interesting for me to witness this, is that Putin is really good at killing individuals. He's good at targeting, Prigozhin, because he challenged him on the battlefield, and good at targeting Navalny and Nemtsov because they were popular. But he's really bad at dealing with public uprisings. And he hopes they die down. He tries to quash them. But I can imagine a scenario in Russia where the situation gets so bad for the people that the risk of being imprisoned or hurt during an uprising is overcome by the just absolute degrading life that everyone is experiencing. And I can easily imagine that, a situation where Putin tries to put it under control and it just ends up growing. And that will be the way that this whole thing comes undone.
Nikolai, Bill mentioned Prigozhin. Do you think there's any likely opposition from the military?
First of all, I don't think that Prigozhin was a kind of opposition within military. There was, of course, a kind of clash between military from one side and secret services from other side, and Prigozhin did clearly represent the second camp. But the war is going on, and it means that 100,000 of Russians are participating there. They do have weapons, so nothing can be excluded. And it's the real threat for the country when and if all those guys will come back. That's why, in my view, Putin is not interested to end the war. He's interested to keep it, perhaps not that intensive, but not to end it and not to respond to the very rational questions: what were the reasons and why the country lost that much in order to achieve goals which were still not formulated. So I am not waiting for any serious military opposition, but everything can happen.
I wish podcasts could capture expressions of face. As I can see your face, and the grimace you gave when I asked that question was quite something. Yulia, can I come to you just finally on this point about Navalny, whether his widow Yulia Navalny might, in any sense, be a focus of opposition? She took the decision, as she said, to speak at the Munich Security Conference just after the news of his death came through, and has been prominent in the past few days. What do you think?
So I would say that for most of Russians, Yulia Navalny's face is not familiar, but obviously her surname speaks much louder. She was quite popular within the opposition as a kind of iconic figure of a perfect mother and wife, because she was always with Alexei Navalny during protests and the court hearings after he was poisoned. And a lot of people were admiring their, romantic relationships between them. I remember there was an idea in 2018 during presidential election to actually put Yulia forward to presidential election instead of Alexei Navalny because he wasn't allowed to participate. But at that point, people were thinking that rating of Alexei Navalny is higher and kind of political rating is not easily passed to someone else. But now we're going to see what kind of politician Yulia Navalny is, because Navalny was wearing many hats. He was investigator, he was politician, and he was street protest leader, and that's why he was successful. But Yulia at the moment has something else to offer, and I feel this something new is the fury. Because the regime stands on propaganda and repression, which leads to the fear and demobilization of society. I feel like the fury is actually the very emotion that will lead to the mobilization of society.
Bill, you're nodding.
Yeah, it's Putin created a monster by killing Alexei, thinking that he got rid of somebody, and then all of a sudden, his wife, who shares all the same characteristics, she's tall, she's attractive, she's charismatic, but she has this one thing which it's just unstoppable, which is the righteous anger of a woman whose husband was murdered by this little dictator. And I think that that's very, very powerful. And I think that Putin underestimated it. And I think that that's going to be viral in the same way as Alexei was. And everybody is desperately hoping for some continuation of the hope that Alexei offered, and she's offering that. And I wouldn't underestimate in any way how this thing is going to play itself out with her in charge of the opposition.
Well, let's go to the bigger question of what Russians think of Russia at the moment. And Nikolai, I wonder if you could start us off with whether there are ways of working out what people think. We've had diplomats, Western diplomats, telling us, look, this is an environment where people's children can be taken away from them or threatened if they draw a pro-Ukrainian picture at school or something. This is not an easy environment in which to work out what Russians are thinking.
Yes, absolutely. But I am not that much hopeful as some of experts who are saying that, well, in case of totalitarian or quasi-totalitarian regime, we should not look at sociological polls. They are not giving us any real information. I think that majority of Russians do share apathy, and that's enough for the Kremlin. The Kremlin doesn't want them to be mobilized and to support wholeheartedly what the Kremlin is doing. It's pretty risky. What the Kremlin wants and what it gets is pessimism and it's escapism when any person who cannot live in psychological comfort with the idea that his government is committing crimes and is responsible for the bloody war These persons are looking for any kind of niche, are focused not that much on the fate of the world and what the country is doing, and whether they are responsible, at least partly, for what their leadership is doing, but they are focused on their concrete work. And this is what we have now with regard to elites and with regard to ordinary Russians. So we do not have active support. We do have certain minority, although very visible minority, who do share Navalny's views and who do not support the war, but we do have majority who are eager to keep being passive.
Yulia, you've got some data about Russian attitudes to the war in Ukraine, which I'd love to hear, and also your sense as a journalist of what Russians now know about the world outside Russia.
As Nikolai mentioned, we probably shouldn't believe the data in authoritarian regimes, and especially in the times of war. But we have two independent sources, which is Levada and Russian Field. And the picture looks like, as of November, December, around 75% of Russians actually support actions of Russia in Ukraine. So they support the war in Ukraine. And people believe that special operations, is what it's called in Russia, is being carried out successfully. But at the same time, and there is a glimpse of hope, that actually from 48 to 55% of Russians are now in favor of peace negotiations. And this number continues to grow. It's actually the first time since the start of the full-scale invasion when this number outweighs those in favor of continuing the special military operation. And the other interesting fact is that usually continued military action is generally supported by wealthy respondents, while low-income respondents are usually in favor of transition to negotiations. And I feel like there's a big parallel, we should draw a parallel between what Russians worried about, because according to polls, on the first place, there would be inflation and rising prices. The second place would be so-called special military operation and things around it, like second mobilization, let's say. And the third thing is corruption. So I feel like this growing number of people that want Russia to move to peace negotiations is a bit reassuring, but at the same time, I feel like it comes from general tiredness of the war and declining living standards and growing prices within the country, rather than actually people thinking that we are doing something wrong in Ukraine.
That's really elegantly put. Thank you. Bill, I wanted to ask you, as I said at the beginning, about this very contested question of seizing Russian assets for Ukraine. All kinds of people have come out in favor of this. It was a big point of debate at the Munich Security Conference, where you and I have been recently, and the EU and G7 countries froze over $300 billion of Russian central bank assets after the invasion of Ukraine, the recent invasion of Ukraine, not Crimea. But there is a big debate about whether or not those can be handed to Ukraine to help rebuild or even for its defense. And we've got Euroclear, the European financial organization, which holds many of those, saying, no, don't do this. And quite a few American senators saying, no, this will ruin the financial system. Where are you on this?
Well, I think that it's kind of a no-brainer. Putin broke international law, invaded a neighboring country, has caused, depending on whose estimates you believe, up to $1 trillion of damages. And thankfully, at the moment that the war broke out, we in the West froze, as you say, more than $300 billion of his central bank reserves. It's the correct decision morally. It's the correct decision financially. And it's the correct decision politically. I mean, it's sort of absurd to say we should be spending money, taxpayer money, on Ukraine before Putin spends his own money on Ukraine, and we have his money. And so what I see happening is it's one of these things where if you ask like a prime minister you should do, or say to a prime minister, you should do this, he'll then ask his legal counsel, can I do this? And the legal counsel will say, absolutely not, it's not legal. And then if he were to ask a different question, though, is if he asks his legal counsel, how do I do this? Then the legal counsel will say, well, actually, you need to use this law and that, and you need to put together this legislation so it all works. What I can say for sure is that Euroclear, which is a private company, shouldn't be determining sort of geostrategic security issues. I mean, it's not their place to have any role in this debate. I mean, it's completely irrelevant. and nor should banks or anyone else for that matter. That this is a defense decision, and it should be made in the obvious way of confiscating the money. And particularly as we're now, seeing people whining about in Congress about sending $63 billion to Ukraine, and more importantly, Donald Trump is going to come in, or may come in. Let's say we don't.
Thank you. I was just about to leap in there. So this is not a done deal with the American people.
He may come in, may not come in. But let's say he comes in, he then cuts off Ukraine, and then the European Union and UK and other allies will have to decide: do we want to double down when this is already expensive, or do we want to give up? And there's probably a lot of people in the give up category. And so it's this $300 billion I view as Donald Trump insurance.
All right. Well, there are other points of view, and I'm thinking of central bankers who say, look, this is going to undermine the financial system. But we don't have time now to go into that, though I often say this on the podcast, this one is really coming. We will have a big debate about that in a few weeks on the use of such assets. Nikolai, I was wondering if you could just help us look forward to the election that is coming. No one feels in very much doubt about that Putin will emerge as the winner of it. But what should we look for in it, particularly after Navalny's death, in terms of this question of what Russians think?
Well, I think that elections are very important for any authoritarian leader. And it's time when regime cannot feel being safe as usually. And there are two problems I see in connection to forthcoming Russian elections, presidential elections. One is connected with the fact that Putin, who did stage the whole thing, who did choose candidates to compete with, he is in a very complicated position because each time he should demonstrate higher results than in previous elections, especially now because the war is going on. And the Kremlin should demonstrate that overwhelming majority of Russians support this war. But even last time, the Kremlin did use all possible resources to demonstrate high voting results. So it becomes more and more complicated because it's not that easy to report about any results, as we've seen in case of Belarusian elections, when Lukashenko did try to demonstrate results much higher than looked reasonable, and it caused huge popular unrest. So one problem for the Kremlin is to get results higher than they did get last time. It's about 60 million votes, but it should be got in all parts of Russia, including Moscow and St. Petersburg and big cities where the attitude to the regime and Putin is not that positive as in other parts of the country. But there is another part of the problem. It's to avoid any scandals, to avoid any speculations based on evidences that there were fraudulent elections. And this is rather complicated as well. That's why what has happened in case of Nadezhdin, one of the candidates who was not registered, but there were huge lines and he was the single one claiming to stop the war. It did already damage the image of elections in terms of overwhelming majority staying behind President Putin as the permanent leader of the country.
Yulia, what will you look for?
I agree with Nikolai, and I don't think that this year Kremlin would have any problems actually getting the 80% as they want to do so, because if we look at the polls, when people ask who they're going to vote for if the elections is happening next Sunday, around 60% at the moment say it's going to be Vladimir Putin. I feel like there is a growing feeling of isolation in Russia and among Russian people, not only because of Western narratives about Russia, but also because of the limited access to quality goods and services due to sanctions. And so people feel excluded. And again, I feel like this is an important thing to mention, that most of people who say that they support a special military operation, that is called in Russia, and who support Putin, they never had a travel document to actually go abroad. Saying that, I think This is why it's important at the moment for the West to find the right words to communicate with Russians and to actually communicate to them. This is not them that the West wants to punish. It's the regime in that country. And I feel like the West should find the right words for that.
And I was asking you just a moment ago, as a journalist, what the quality of information that Russians have is when they're looking at things like this election or indeed Navalny's death.
I feel like it really depends. So let's say among young people, obviously, they do have access to VPNs, and that's why they would have access to Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, social media, and access to independent media as well. Whereas older people obviously don't know about such technologies, and now there is a law in Russia that actually prohibits companies from advertising any type of VPN. So probably things going to get worse in terms of access to information. And again, a lot of politically active people left Russia either when the full-scale invasion started or after the announced mobilization in September 2022. So we now actually see that people in Moscow, they're more supportive of the war rather than people in Russian regions. It's really hard to say, whereas while people in villages don't have a good connection to internet and probably they're not reading opposition media, at the same time they're feeling the impact of the war more than those living in big cities. So yeah, I feel that's the trend.
Let me just ask you what was occurring to me when Bill was talking. You had an interesting point before we were actually started this recording about how you thought the assets of Russia ought to be used.
My position is that Russian frozen assets should be passed for the restoration of Ukraine. But there is a position that I heard that some of this money might actually be saved for the future Russia, because the country will need this money after the transition from totalitarian regime to something more democratic and liberal. It's a very debatable point. But yeah, I think it's not the first priority as well. But I feel like this is something that should be kept in mind when discussing these questions.
Nikolai.
Well, in my view, there should be the list of priorities. And of course, to restore Ukrainian economy and to cover this huge damage, which is result of the war, is priority number one. If only something will remain, I would join Yulia's position that it would be good to keep it in order to promote Russia's transition to democracy, but not at the expense of Ukrainian recovery.
No, not at all. Yeah, it wasn't my point. Yeah.
Okay, but at least you took us through to a possible vision of another Russia in the future, which has not been where the center of gravity of this conversation has been. We're going to have to stop there. A big thank you to my guests, Bill Browder, Yulia Mineeva, Nikolai Petrov. Do follow them all on X or Twitter, whichever name you prefer. Their details are going to be in the show notes. And a reminder that you can find all of our podcasts on all major podcast platforms, as well as through our social media. So please do like, follow, subscribe, and leave us a review. To read more from all of our experts or to find out about our events, and we have a lot coming, including on these subjects, don't forget to visit chathamhouse.org, and you can find there the work of our Russia and Eurasia program. Goodbye from me, Bronwen Maddox. See you next time.